That means you as a professional said, this survey is correct. It meets all the requirements for to register it. Why would we deny that?
You wouldn't necessarily, and maybe I misspoke or.
No, I'm not saying you did, please don't, because sometimes it's like we're looking at a survey and we're saying, well, yeah, okay, so the survey's correct. But this is a dumb question and maybe, but what's our role beyond that? Is our role to understand the intent or what are the types of things we'd be reviewing it for? Maybe you can't answer that, but that's what go ahead.
Yeah, and I can get into that a little bit. I'll get into each of the different kinds of surveys and generally what we're looking at on those. But I'll let Jeremy jump in a little bit from the planner standpoint, but, as far as like Musselshell County, without having zoning, we're not really gonna look at, we're not really gonna scrutinize what their intent or what the use on the property is, right? The survey review process simply is just to make sure that they're using that exemption correctly. So basically, like if they say that they're doing a boundary line relocation, that means they're just moving the line between two properties. We literally just look at it and make sure that's all they're doing, because sometimes maybe they are trying to be a little sneaky and the two properties don't exist and they're creating a tract, or maybe the line that they're moving for whatever reason is going to cause issues with where there's current improvements. Like let's say they have a drain field and they're moving the line and it's going to place the drain field on the opposite property of where the residence is at, so the sanitarium will look at that sort of thing. That's all we're really reviewing for. So when it comes to you guys, you're not really looking at it for any other items, like as far as their intended use, because there's no regulations that allow the reviewing authority to really weigh in on that. That would be like if you have countywide zoning that said that they could or couldn't have, a certain type of building or business on the property.
Yeah, and I'll jump in too. So yeah, just like what Jake said, we're not, for a survey review, we're not looking at land use. The only other thing I would add to that is as part of the survey, they have to have the exemption on the survey for the subdivision side, but they also have to have the DEQ exemption on there. So they're also stating that either it's exempt from DEQ review, so either there already is an existing system on it, the tracts are over 20 acres, or they're just not going to put water and sewer on the tracts, and they're basically put a sanitary restriction on it. We also reviewed that part of it too. We actually send the survey to the county sanitarian, in this case Central Montana Health, to have them review that exemption and make sure that it's appropriate. And so they have a chance to chime in as well. That would be really the only point at which possibly somebody's reviewing land use is during some kind of a sanitation review portion, where they're, if somebody decides, if it's less than 20 acres, they decide they want to develop it, then they would go through that DEQ review process, which would review the water, sewer, and stormwater on the property, and land use comes into that a little bit. But they're not, even in that instance, they're not reviewing whether the land use is appropriate for the property. They're only reviewing the land use and making sure that the water, wastewater, and stormwater systems are designed, according to the land use they're proposing. So there's no regulations that say, you can and can't put certain land use on a piece of property. So, and I think the only other thing I would say, just adding on, the only thing that the local government, the commissioners could do, adding to the process of reviewing the survey, is we would be looking at the survey to basically concur with Jake and I that they're not trying to evade the Subdivision and Platting Act. So it's called the evasion criteria. And so you're basically, the boundary line relocations are pretty simple, right? They're not creating new tracts of land with a boundary line relocation, right? So those are kind of pretty straightforward. Same thing for the tracements and some other surveys. I think where we get mostly into the evasion criteria is family transfers, right? Are they meeting the criteria for a family transfer? because they're actually creating new tracts of ground. That's really the only survey besides an ag exemption that creates new tracts. And so family transfers and ag exemptions, which you guys review anyway now because you guys have to approve the ag covenant. Family transfers would be really the only one that you might look at and just make sure that, you know, with Jake and I, that they're not trying to evade the Subdivision and Plating Act when they're with creation of these tracts by
Okay,
using the
Let me
exemption.
stop you there, that's an excellent. How would you determine whether you thought they might be trying to evade? Would you,
So,
go ahead.
yeah, that's a good one. I mean, there's certain criteria we have in the subdivision regulations under family transfers, right? And so there's certain requirements under the regulations and state law that allow certain things. And so as long as they meet those criteria, so for instance, you can't do a family, oh yeah, go ahead.
Can I, if I share my screen for you guys, are you able to see it? Is that gonna work for you?
Well, see if you can.
I think they need to be designated as a co-host to the meeting.
How do I do that?
That's an excellent question.
Yeah, it doesn't look like we have the option to share, Jake. I don't see it.
It'd be just,
I was gonna
you
pull
would be
up,
able to see it.
Jeremy kinda jumped ahead on my thing, I was gonna go through each of the exemption types of surveys, and then basically just work through the subdivision regs. It would just take a second, and basically, the Muscle Shoals County subdivision regs that WWC put together list the evasion criteria for each type of exemption survey. And it's really important that we follow those because they're listed as rebuttable presumptions. And if you step outside of the rebuttable presumptions on any of those, that's where you can get in trouble. And you know, our main goal is to basically keep you guys out of the newspaper and keep you out of trouble. So you know, we don't want to be stepping outside of what's in the regulations. So just real quick, I scrolled forward to, I can't share my screen, but under the
I'll just jump in just real quick too. Other thing, there's a lot of questions and calls that Jake and I get from residents in Muscle Shoals County on what can we do. And so there's a lot of surveys I would say that you guys don't ever see because somebody calls and says, hey, I want to do X, Y, and Z, and we walk them through the process and the requirements for them to be able to do that. And a lot of times their situation doesn't allow them to do a family transfer. Or their situation, like we can't meet those rebuttable presumptions or those evasion criteria. And so they would have to go through a minor subdivision process or a major subdivision process. And then we walk through that process and typically they're like, no, we don't want to do that. Right, because the subdivision processes can be lengthy and cumbersome, and so I don't know. I mean, I can't put a number to it, but Jake and I hear probably calls several times a month from people wanting to do certain things, and we so I would just tell you that there's a lot, even though you see quite a few of these surveys coming through potentially, we're also heading some of those off. Because they can't meet those evasion criteria.
I give out their number a lot.
Really?
We really appreciate this too, I'll let you continue, but I'm really ignorant to this process, and so this is really helpful.
Yeah, that's fine, and I guess that's kind of why we're here, and I think you guys, you probably are more privy to it than you realize just from how many of these you've seen. It's not real complicated, but like Jeremy said, a lot of people just call saying, hey, I want to do this with my property, and we give them the whoa, that's not how things work type thing. So it does head off a lot of, it's not like we're seeing a bunch of surveys. That's probably explains why we don't have a lot of denials on surveys. Even the surveys in the past that we've denied from the standpoint of it comes to review, and we say, you can't do it, it usually hinges around the sanitation side of things, and all that really happens there is they use a different exemption or they're required to go through minor subdivision. So it doesn't necessarily keep the survey from happening, they just have to use a different avenue. But yeah, so I guess I'm just gonna try and keep following my deal just a little bit so I don't leave anything out for you guys. So the ELS, and Bob did a good job kind of hitting on this for me. So the ELS, I'm only reviewing, by statute, I'm only reviewing for errors and omissions in calculations and drafting. Now, I use a pretty broad definition of that, as do most ELSs. You know, to me, an error would be, most people think of that, if it's in calculations and drafting, an error is basically a mathematical, like a misclosure on the parcel, or a typo in the bearing or the distance of a line, or an acreage for that matter, or maybe a typo in the legal description. I do look for those sorts of things. We check, we run mathematical closures on everything. We check the legal descriptions to make sure they're accurate and complete, so on and so forth. We check for incorrect citations on the exemptions. A lot of surveyors are known to copy and paste from past surveys. And as you know, the legislature every 2 years changes things, and so maybe the citation is wrong. It hasn't been updated to the current MCAs. And then I also check to just make sure there's proper usage of the exemption. A lot of times, there's been times where we get surveys that are labeled a retracement survey. Well, a retracement survey is the most simple form of a survey. It's basically a tract of record that exists somewhere that's never really been surveyed, or maybe they want an updated survey because they found out there was errors in the previous survey. And so it comes through, it's not even listed in the MCA 763207 as an exempt survey. It's just exempt by nature because it's not creating any new parcels. It's just showing something that already exists. But a lot of times we get a survey called a retracement survey, but the parcel that it allegedly is retracing doesn't exist on record. So that would be an instance where I call the surveyor and say, hey, nice try, but this exemption doesn't apply because the tract of record that you're purporting to retrace doesn't exist. And that would be one exemption. But basically, if it's not in the MCAs, or if it's not in the ARMs, which is the administrative rules, if it's not an MCA or ARM, my comments are basically a suggestion. So there have been times where I suggest to the surveyor, hey, you know, it'd be really great if you could, you know, move this text around. It's over the top of something else, or, you know, odd stuff like that. I can't really think of a good example, but I give surveyors suggestions from time to time that they can choose to make or not make. But for the most part, my edits are strictly from a mathematical standpoint, and then just basic typos. You know, maybe they have the wrong township section range listed in the legal description, or they have a typo like northeast quarter instead of southeast quarter, something simple like that. So then the next thing, I was just going to clarify the exempt surveys versus the subdivision plat. So when a subdivision plat comes through, Jeremy reviews it, and that's a whole different process, right? And that's where we do get into a little bit of, you know, they have to follow your subdivision regs, and you guys play a lot bigger role in that because you can impose conditions of approval, and this is where we get into things like legal and physical access, and you know, the roads and stormwater and all this stuff, versus an exempt survey is truly exempt. We cannot impose, it's very important actually that we don't try to impose any conditions of approval. So that would be something like somebody comes in with a family transfer and we say, well, we really want to keep you to, you know, this is a pretty small piece of property you're splitting up. We'd really not like to see any new houses go up on it. Right? We can't do that. Or hey, this property's, you know, right next door to the school. It'd be really great if you didn't put, you know, a high traffic business there or something. Like, sooner or later, maybe one of the families is going to buy, or one of the kids is going to develop the property and put a commercial business there. We don't really have a lot of control over that because there's not zoning in place. And that's not where the survey review process isn't where that would come into play anyways. So the exempt
Can I stop you
surveys-
there? Would that be something
Yeah.
that would be governed by covenants or something to that effect?
Yep.
So,
Yeah, covenants can come into play, but the commissioners don't necessarily, or us on that, for that matter, we would not be we would not be the reviewing or the enforcing authority in that situation. The covenants are usually enforced by the HOA. Yep. it doesn't hurt to remind them like, hey, you have covenants and it looks like you're doing something that's gonna violate your covenants. Once again, it's more kind of like a suggestion. We wouldn't get involved from the enforcement standpoint.
You
That's
can't,
the-
we
that's the
understand
point.
that you can't, but we feel, well, we do have a little bit of responsibility to remind them that they do need to follow some rules here. And that's why we have that
There's not a
responsibility.
subdivision board for that. Yeah.
We do, but they're not doing their job either.
Well,
They're
even the
not.
planning board, yeah.
Our planning board doesn't do crap.
Yeah, I would just remind you that covenants are a private agreement between landowners. They are not administered by the county or the county commissioners.
Right.
And you cannot legally enforce covenants. The only way to legally enforce covenants is through the courts.
Yeah,
So there's one
civil
landowner
action.
against another landowner. Now, Mike, I agree with you, it's always good to remind people and suggest that, hey, you have covenants, maybe
Right.
you're not meeting your covenants. and you need to
Exactly.
look at that, right?
That's my
But
point.
you can't,
Yeah, we
but the
seem to do
county
that
can't
quite
step in
often.
and try to enforce those.
Right, no, we can't do that. We understand that, but we do need to have there's nothing wrong with us having the discussion with them.
Nope, there is nothing wrong with that for sure.
Right. We do bring it up quite often.
Although this is a really good discussion here, because we've been sucked into these types of things. And Ben has kinda pulled us back and say we neither have we do not have the authority to do anything, and therefore we're not gonna discuss it. It's a civil matter, you know. But when we see something that's kinda glaringly obvious to us, I think Mike's right, to just let him know, hey, by the way, you can't create a subdivision out of this. That's kind of the deal, somebody does a family transfer and you know you have a strong suspicion what their intent is, but it doesn't matter, we can't do anything about it, and if they do something that violates their covenant, we still can't, that's up to a civil matter, is that kind of where you're?
Yeah,
That's, yeah, unless you have zoning. So zoning is the only thing that, your
Yeah.
regulations are the only things you guys can enforce. So if zoning got put in place, either part one or part two zoning in the county, that you can enforce those zoning
Right.
regulations. So, right, so then that, if there's a minimum lot size, for instance, in the zoning regulations, then the family transfer or whatever has to follow those requirements,
Sure.
right? So you would be, we as your contract
Right.
planner would be reviewing to ensure that those things are met, right, within the zoning. But covenants, we don't, we
Right.
can't.
Exactly.
We can say, a lot of times I'll suggest, especially if it's somebody is doing something within an existing subdivision, I'll say, hey, have you checked your covenants to make sure that you can do this, right? And I'll just kind of push them that way, but we don't get the covenants typically, and we don't check to make sure it meets covenants, because we really have no legal authority to do that. Some counties will try to do that, but they can't legally do that.
And we know better.
Yeah, well, we've got
We've got
our
our hands
hand
full.
burned before on that, so thanks to
Yeah.
our county attorney, we don't do that anymore.
yep,
Okay,
yeah,
go
it's
ahead.
good to listen to those guys for sure. So so I think we're kind of clear on the exempt surveys versus the subdivision plats.
Yeah.
And the big one being that subdivision plats can impose, it's just a completely different process, there's public hearing, all this, and they can impose conditions, whereas the exempt surveys just don't even fall under that process at all. And basically, I'm the only one that touches the exempt survey other than, like Jeremy said, the sanitarian. And me and Jeremy work pretty close. A lot of times I'll have him just take a quick glance at the exempt surveys just to make sure nothing pops out as a red flag to him.
And I think the only caveat to the condition or covenant is an ag exemption, right? The
Yeah.
county commissioners with an ag exemption, they're saying, we're gonna create this tract of record, this new tract, and we don't have any intention of developing it, we wanna leave it ag, and so we're gonna put an ag covenant on it, because we can't use a family transfer, we can't use some other process, so we're gonna put this ag exemption on it. And it basically, that is a land use restriction, right? So that is the one caveat to all this, is the ag exemption process. You are putting a land use restriction on that property that tract can only be used for agricultural purposes.
So they're
So if they want to lift that ag exemption or ag covenant
Yeah.
off of the property, the subdivision regulations for Muscle County require that they go through minor subdivision review process to lift the ag covenant and be able to develop that tract. And Jake and I actually got one this morning, or last night, we actually got one, somebody submitted to us that you guys approved in 2023, it looked like, and now they wanna put a house on it. And so, I sent him an email back this morning saying, hey, there's an ag covenant on this, you gotta go through the minor subdivision process before you can develop that lot, right? And so we'll be working with them through that process, so you'll see that probably in the next several months, you'll probably see that in front of you potentially, so, that's the only caveat, I guess.
Yep, and that's kind of why as well, when we get to the end, as far as talking about your involvement, you know, the commissioners over the years, we've decided, we've went back and forth whether you guys wanna sign every exempt survey or not. And the only ones that do, or I guess that, you know, and the county attorney could probably weigh in here, but the only ones that we usually require the commissioners to sign off on for that reason is the ag cert, because you're basically granting them a covenant. It's essentially a minor subdivision with ag, or with land use restrictions. So it almost functions like a subdivision plat, and so we usually do have the commissioner cert on there, especially for this reason, so that when it comes back and they ask to lift it, it's really clear that it has to go before the reviewing authority and get approved in the same manner that a subdivision would.
All right, let me stop you
There's
there.
tax implications there as well, so, yeah,
Yeah.
we have to know.
Oh, well, so that's come up, so let's say somebody says they wanna, I guess, they wanna make it ag. What's the process there? I guess we would be approving that? I guess I'm trying to, there's a difference between trying to change it from an ag to making it an ag.
Yeah,
What's the nuances of getting, if somebody's wanting to make it ag, how do we know that? How do we even know that's what they're trying to do?
we apply for it.
It says that on
Well,
the
I mean,
survey.
yeah, so, I mean, when they're submitting the survey, right, they're saying, you know, they're saying in their application on the survey, we're creating this tract, it's gonna be labeled as an agricultural exemption on the plat, and they bring a covenant to the county commissioners for you guys to review that restricts the land use on that tract that they're creating, it's just on that one tract they're creating, right? That they're good, that land use is restricted to agricultural only, period. They cannot use it, they can't build a shop on it, they can't build anything on it. It's strictly used for ag. And so, if they wanna lift that, so say they do that 5 years ago.
Well, let me stop you there, Jeremy. So if they wanna do that, why would we object to that? Or why would we be the ones making the call on whether we're gonna let them do it or not?
We want it, Jack.
Because it's almost a county imposed covenant on the property. So Jake and I can't sign that, that's gotta be a reviewed thing by the county commissioners, by the government authority. You guys are the government, the local government, body. And so, because it's a covenant and land use restriction specifically on that land, you guys have to review that and approve it before it gets filed.
Well, let me stop you there too. So this is where Mike's bringing in the tax implications, right, Mike? Somebody might wanna do that to reduce their tax, right?
We've got.
Well, no, that's
yeah,
different,
that's what-
that taxes is different, we're talking about survey.
Yeah,
So if somebody wants to do that on taxes, that's a deal.
Yeah, but if they
with
change the land use, isn't the tax change?
It does change, yeah.
Yeah, but that's a deal that they work out with Department of Revenue or the county assessor or whatever. That we don't do anything with taxes, so
No.
that would, and then if somebody wanted to change something outside of the survey process, like somebody says, oh, well, you taxed me wrong on this, I want it to be ag, then they have to work through the county assessor or the Department of Revenue, right, for that assessment. That's not something we would do.
I think what he's asking though, Jeremy, Bob, let me jump in. I think, so what he's asking is, if somebody was gonna do the ag exemption survey, and the purpose of it seemed to be just so that they could lower their taxable value on the land by getting it changed over to ag, is there any reason that they would deny the ag exemption? And my answer would be no, as long as it meets all the criteria of an agricultural tract, because there's no zoning, there's nothing like that otherwise that would restrict it being ag. It almost kind of goes the other way. It almost kind of goes, if somebody presented you with an ag tract parcel proposal saying, hey, we're gonna convert this over to an ag tract, and then come to find out it has some buildings on it or some facilities like an old ranch house with a septic and a well, it's like, whoa, this entire parcel is technically not ag. And so what we see a lot of times is it'll be like a quarter section, right? 160 acres. And it's got a farmhouse and some corrals and a shop or whatever down in one corner off the highway. They'll create an ag parcel out of like 150 acres or 155, and they'll carve out, 5-10 acres around all the buildings. And then that way the ag, the portion that's left over is ag. They can lease that separate. They could sell that off separate if they wanted because it creates that separate parcel. It's truly just ag land. It's usually under a center pivot or it's range land or whatever. And so that's usually the use of the ag exemption. And kind of to keep going down that rabbit hole, I don't really worry too much about the ag exemption being abused, especially in the counties where you do have professional, consultants under contract, because if they try to resubmit and lift that ag exemption, like Jeremy says, the first thing we do is tell them, no, you gotta go through full subdivision review on that.
All right, so before you guys ask questions, hold on, because I can feel questions percolating in your minds, and I'm gonna cut you off right there. So when someone is doing this and they've kind of separated off that homestead from the ag land, then there would be a covenant on the remaining ag land, and if they were trying to divide that up, that's where the county can then step in and say, no, you have to do a subdivision.
Correct, 100%. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
But what piece of that would you guys catch in your review?
Say that again, Bob?
What piece of that would you guys catch? In other words, if they did want to divide it and they submitted, how do we know intent, I guess, is where I'm headed. I guess what you described, Ben, is okay. Repeat what you just said.
Not a chance I'm gonna be able to do that. That's what the recording's for. It clarified it, I guess, for me, and I think the point is that we don't need to establish intent, because nothing else is gonna get built on that land, because it was utilized for an ag exemption, and they already looked at the survey to make sure there isn't any other structure, septic,
That's where I was
well,
headed.
etc.
You would catch that if there actually had buildings on there. If they actually were trying to turn land into ag that actually wasn't ag, you would catch that in the survey.
Yeah, correct. When they send it
If it's
to
ag land,
keep in
you
mind that
could save money by
we send it off to
making it
Barb
exempt.
Kinley, and then she's gonna look at it to make sure there's no existing, like septic permits on there, know that they haven't been given any, granted any permits for improved, septic systems on there, so that in the future they couldn't build anything. And the flip side of that is when it does come back, so, let's just kind of play the what if game. So like this one, for instance, in 2023, this property, had a tract created that was an ag tract, came before, and this would have been when we were reviewing. So WWC would have reviewed it on behalf of Muscle County and basically recommended approval of this ag tract. They created this ag tract. Well, now they're coming back and going, 5, 6, 7 years later, like, hey, we want you know, we've had a change of heart, maybe they wanna build a shop on it, maybe they wanna build a farmhouse on it, whatever the reason is, doesn't really matter to us, but they're just saying, we wanna lift the ag restriction, basically remove the ag covenant that the commissioners